Nearly 18 million cubic meters of earth ripped from the floor of the Mediterranean Sea. Over 100 hectares of artificial land manufactured from nothing. Raw coastline engineered where open water used to be. One small country decided that its existing geography wasn't enough, so it built new geography from scratch. In the middle of the waves, Israel didn't just expand a port, it created land that didn't exist, anchored it against one of the most aggressive seas on Earth, and placed on top of it some of the most advanced cargo infrastructure ever constructed. The numbers alone are staggering, but numbers only tell half the story, because what Israel built in Haifa didn't just solve a shipping problem, it attracted the attention of two superpowers. It collided with a naval base. And it landed in the crosshairs of a trade war most people don't even know is happening, and the fallout, the real fallout, leak is still unfolding right now. This is not just an engineering story, this is the story of a port that was supposed to fix logistics and accidentally placed itself at the center of a global collision. If you're into massive engineering, geopolitics, and the hidden forces shaping global trade, subscribe to the channel, drop a like, and tell us in the comments. Do you think small countries can really compete on this scale? Let's get into it. To understand why Israel did something this extreme, you have to understand the corner it was backed into. By the early 2000s, trade with Asia was exploding. Containers from China, South Korea, Japan, and Southeast Asia were flooding in at an accelerating rate. Electronics, textiles, industrial equipment, machinery parts. About 25% of everything Israel imported arrived from Asian markets, and that share was climbing every single year. Now, logically, there's an obvious route for Asian cargo headed to Israel. Ships leave Shanghai or Singapore, cross the Indian Ocean, enter the Red Sea through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, and arrive at Eilat, Israel's only Red Sea port. Shortest distance, fastest transit. On a map, it's perfect. In reality, it was a disaster. Eilat's docks had a depth of roughly 10 meters. Modern post-Panamax container ships, the standard workhorses of global trade, carry up to 15,000 20-foot containers in a single voyage. Their draft, the depth they sink into the water, reaches 15 meters or more. Simple math. A loaded megaship trying to enter Eilat would scrape the bottom and run aground before it ever touched a berth. So just dredge the harbor, right? Deepen the channel, modernize the docks, and move on. Except three separate problems made that nearly impossible. First, the coral. The Gulf of Aqaba is home to one of the northernmost coral reef ecosystems on the planet. Hundreds of species of fish, mollusks, and crustaceans depend on it. Any large-scale dredging would churn up massive clouds of silt and sediment that would settle on the reefs and suffocate them. Environmental organizations drew a hard line. Touch the bottom and you destroy something irreplaceable. Second, tourism. Eilat's entire local economy revolves around visitors. Hotels, diving centers, beachfront restaurants. Replace that view of turquoise water with dredging barges and container cranes, and the tourism revenue evaporates overnight. Third, and this one is brutal, geography. Eilat sits at the extreme southern tip of the country. Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Haifa, the economic engines, are over 250 kilometers north. And between Eilat and those cities, no rail connection. None. Every container would need to be loaded onto a truck and driven through the Negev desert to the nearest rail junction. Every extra kilometer on wheels drives up the price of goods for every consumer in the country. Israel could have tried to solve each of these problems individually, dredge carefully, compensate the tourism industry, build a desert railway, but stacked together, the cost and complexity made Eilat a dead end for large-scale Asian trade. As the country needed another answer, and the first one it considered was genuinely radical, a plan so ambitious it could have rewritten Israel's entire southern coast. But it never happened. Before Haifa became the solution, there was another idea on the table. One that sounds closer to science fiction than urban planning. It was called the Southern Gateway. The concept was straightforward in theory and staggering in execution. Abandon Eilat's existing port entirely. Don't renovate it. Don't expand it. Walk away from it. Instead, build a completely new deep-water port roughly 4.5 kilometers inland from the coast in the open desert. Then, and here's where it gets extraordinary, cut a canal 4 kilometers long, approximately 100 meters wide, carved directly through the desert floor, on connecting the Gulf of Aqaba to the new inland port. Ships would enter this artificial waterway, travel through the desert, and dock at a modern facility purpose-built with no constraints from existing infrastructure. On paper, it solved everything simultaneously. The coral reefs stayed untouched. The canal's route avoided the most sensitive zones. Tourists on the beach never had to see a single container crane. The new port could be designed from the ground up. Optimal layout, maximum depth, the latest automation, no compromises, no retrofitting. Estimated cost, north of $3 billion. That figure alone was enough to make planners uneasy. But the real killer wasn't the money, it was the politics. Different administrations shifted priorities. Political factions couldn't agree on allocation. The project was delayed, then quietly shelved, then frozen entirely. It lingered on paper for years, a ghost blueprint of what might have been. Had Southern Gateway been built, Eilat might have become a global-class port. The entire strategic calculus of Israeli trade could have shifted south, but reality chose a different path. With the southern option dead, Israel looked north, toward a city that already had railways, highways, and an industrial base. And then it committed to something that, in raw physical terms, was even more extreme. Haifa had almost everything the south lacked. It sits on the Mediterranean coast in northern Israel, close to the country's population centers and economic hubs. Rail lines already connected it to Tel Aviv and points south. Highways fed directly into national road networks. Industry had operated here for decades. Now, what Haifa didn't have was enough port, not for what Israel needed. In 2005, the first phase launched, the Carmel Terminal, and the first task was one that sounds deceptively simple, but required extraordinary precision. They needed to make the seafloor deeper. Specialized vessels moved into position off the Haifa coast. Multi-bucket dredges, think of them as underwater excavators, lowered continuous chains of steel buckets to the seabed. These buckets scraped along the bottom, scooping sand, silt, and compacted sediment, lifting it to the surface and dumping it into waiting barges. Alongside them, trailing suction hopper dredgers operated like enormous vacuum cleaners, their pipes extending to the sea floor, sucking up a slurry of soil and water, pumping it into onboard holds. Even 2.5 million cubic meters of material came up from the bottom. Picture a solid cube with sides of 135 meters, filled completely with wet sand and rock. That's what they pulled from beneath the Mediterranean. But the genius of Carmel wasn't just dredging, it was what they did with the material afterward. Rather than dump it all at sea, the Israelis decided to use it. Every cubic meter of extracted soil became building material for something that hadn't existed minutes before: artificial land. First, steel sheet piles were driven deep into the seabed, forming enormous watertight walls around the target area. These walls created a contained basin, a giant underwater corral, and preventing currents from washing away material before it could be placed. Then, layer by painstaking layer, the dredged material was pumped and deposited inside. Each layer was compacted by heavy machinery. Rollers, vibrating plates, squeezing out water and air, transforming loose sediment into dense, stable ground. Drainage networks were embedded throughout. Channels and pipes designed to pull moisture from deep within the fill, accelerating consolidation. When the artificial ground reached the required height and density, massive reinforced concrete foundations were poured. Key walls rose along 950 meters of new waterfront, 700 meters forming the main berth, another 250 allocated for auxiliary use. 6 heavy lift port cranes were installed along the berths. 12 electric stacking cranes were deployed across the container yard. The Carmel Terminal opened in 2010. Its berths offered 15.5 meters of depth, enough to handle post-Panamax vessels carrying up to 15,000 containers. For the first time in its history, Israel could receive the large ships that dominate modern global trade through its Mediterranean coast. It was a milestone, but the Israelis already knew Carmel was just the proving ground. What came next would dwarf it in every measurable dimension. Construction on the Bayport Terminal began in 2015, and from the very first day, the numbers operated on a different plane entirely. Where Carmel required 2.5 million cubic meters of dredging, Bayport demanded 15 million, 6 times the volume. Imagine a cube with sides stretching 247 meters, nearly the length of 3 football fields in every direction, packed solid with saturated seafloor material. Or load that material into dump trucks and watch the convoy stretch to the horizon and keep going. Dredging operations ran around the clock. Multiple vessels worked in shifts, their suction pipes and bucket chains grinding away at the Mediterranean floor week after week, month after month. month. The target depth, 17.5 meters. This wasn't arbitrary. Bayport was designed from the outset to receive ultra-large container vessels, ULCV class, ships exceeding 400 meters in length, carrying 18,000 containers, with drafts pushing 16 meters. Without that depth, those ships couldn't come within a kilometer of the coast. Of the 15 million cubic meters extracted, 5 million were transported to designated disposal zones on the seabed, areas mapped in advance where the material would settle harmlessly without affecting shipping lanes or marine habitats. The remaining 10 million cubic meters were redirected towards something far more ambitious, an artificial island, 84 hectares of completely new land manufactured in the open Mediterranean. The construction methodology had evolved since Carmel. Engineers drove steel sheet pile walls around the full perimeter of the planned island, creating a sealed outer barrier. But then they added something new, internal partition walls that divided the massive area into separate sections, like compartments in an ice tray. Each section could be filled independently, but allowing engineers to control settlement rates and compaction uniformity across the entire footprint. If one section settled unevenly, it could be corrected without affecting adjacent zones. Fill was deposited in controlled layers. Heavy vibratory compactors pressed each layer flat, forcing out trapped water and air pockets. Drainage systems ran continuously, pulling moisture downward through the fill and out through collection networks. What started as loose, wet sediment gradually transformed into ground dense enough to support thousands of tons of static and dynamic load, and the loads it had to support were immense. Massive reinforced concrete foundation slabs and grillages were poured across the island's surface, engineered to absorb not just weight, but the constant vibration and lateral stress of port crane operations. Quay walls rose along the island's seaward edge, and along those walls, some of the largest ship-to-shore cranes on Earth were erected. Their booms stretched tens of meters above the waterline, capable of reaching across the full beam of an ultra-large container vessel. Processing speed was measured in dozens of containers per hour, per crane. Multiply that across the full berth, and vessel turnaround times dropped from days to hours. If that surprised you, hit like so more people can see this, because we're about to get into what no one talks about. Behind the berths, automated container yards stretched across the island. Robotic stacking cranes moved along preset tracks, sorting and positioning containers with minimal human input. Truck gates operated on automated recognition systems. Cameras scanned license plates. IMEC software-verified documentation. Barriers lifted without a driver ever leaving the cab. New rail spurs connected directly into Israel's national rail network, allowing containers to leave the port on trains bound for distribution centers across the country. But none of this mattered if the sea itself couldn't be controlled. Waves, storm surges, relentless currents. The Mediterranean doesn't forgive exposed infrastructure. The artificial island and its berths needed a shield, so the Israelis built one. The existing main breakwater was extended by 882 meters. Then, separately, an entirely new auxiliary breakwater was constructed, stretching 2,100 meters, more than 2 kilometers of wave barrier built from the water up. The construction method was itself a feat. Reinforced concrete caissons, enormous hollow boxes, were cast on shore, then floated into the sea like boats. Tugboats guided them into precise positions along the breakwater alignment. Once in place, the caissons were flooded with a mixture of sand and concrete, sinking them to the seabed where they locked into position like massive interlocking blocks. Stone layers were placed on top and around them, adding weight and wave-absorbing texture. In total, over 43,000 shaped concrete armor units were placed, backed by 5.3 million tons of quarried stone. These breakwaters absorb incoming wave energy, dissipating it before it reaches the port basin. They also block sediment transport, preventing ocean currents from silting up the deep channels that the dredges worked so hard to excavate. When Bayport opened, it transformed Haifa's capacity overnight. Combined with Carmel, the port could now handle 1.5 million 20-foot equivalent containers annually. Not in the league of Shanghai or Singapore, but for a country smaller than New Jersey, it was an enormous leap. More importantly, Israel could finally receive the largest container ships sailing the world's oceans. On paper, Bayport was an engineering masterpiece, a showcase of what modern marine construction could achieve. But during its development, Israel made one decision that had nothing to do with engineering. and it set off alarms on the other side of the world. To operate the new Bayport terminal, Israel didn't choose a domestic company, it didn't choose an American one or a European one. So it awarded a 25-year concession to Shanghai International Port Group, SIPG, a Chinese company, state-linked, backed by the same government driving the most aggressive infrastructure acquisition campaign in modern history. This requires context. By the mid-2000s, China's Belt and Road Initiative was reshaping global port access at a pace that made Western strategists deeply uncomfortable. Chinese state-affiliated firms had secured operational stakes or outright ownership of critical ports across multiple continents. Piraeus in Greece, majority controlled by COSCO. Hambantota in Sri Lanka, handed over on a 99-year lease after the country couldn't repay Chinese loans. Gwadar in Pakistan, Djibouti in the Horn of Africa. The pattern was unmistakable, systematically securing access to choke points and trade corridors worldwide. Haifa fit the pattern with almost unsettling precision, a deep-water Mediterranean port, strategically positioned where Asia, Europe, and Africa converge. Brand new infrastructure purpose-built for the largest vessels on Earth, and now operated by a Chinese state-connected entity, SIPG assumed operational control of Bayport in 2021. From China's perspective, this was a logical commercial move. Access to a modern, efficient Mediterranean hub that strengthened its logistics network between East Asia and Southern Europe. For Israel, the deal brought investment, operational expertise, and a strong commercial partner. What it also brought was a problem that some analysts believe was dramatically underestimated. Comment below, do you think a deal like this is just business or something more? Because what comes next might change your answer. Here is the detail that turned a port concession into an international flashpoint. Haifa is not just a commercial port city, it's home to Israel's primary naval base, and it has long served as a regular port of call for the United States 6th Fleet, one of America's key naval forces in the Mediterranean and the wider Middle East theater. Reports suggest that U.S. intelligence agencies flagged the SIPG concession with growing urgency. The concern was not subtle. A Chinese state-affiliated company would be operating advanced port infrastructure, including surveillance-capable crane systems, data networks, and vessel tracking technology, less than 2 kilometers from facilities used by both the Israeli Navy and visiting American warships. Some former U.S. officials, speaking to defense-focused media outlets, reportedly warned that port operations could provide opportunities to monitor naval vessel movements, maintenance schedules, submarine activity, and the logistics patterns of a key American ally. Others argued that the risk was overstated, that commercial port operations and military operations are sufficiently separated. But the pressure was real. Reports indicate that multiple U.S. administrations raised the issue with Israeli leadership. Some accounts suggest American officials warned, quietly but firmly, that Chinese operational presence near a shared naval facility could lead to reduced intelligence sharing or curtailed American naval visits to Haifa. Israel found itself wedged between its most critical military ally and its largest trading partner in Asia. The diplomatic position was nearly impossible. Canceling the concession would damage relations with Beijing and potentially invite legal challenges. Maintaining it risked friction with Washington at a time when regional security threats demanded closer cooperation, not distance. Israeli authorities reportedly implemented enhanced oversight measures, restrictions on SIPG's access to certain port areas, limitations on data collection, increased security protocols near the naval zone. Whether those measures fully address the concerns raised by American intelligence remains a matter of debate among analysts. Some experts describe Haifa as one of the clearest case studies in how Belt and Road infrastructure creates leverage, not through military force, but through operational presence in strategically sensitive locations. Others counter that the commercial benefits outweigh the risks, and that proper regulation can manage security concerns without dismantling the partnership. What is undeniable is that a port built to solve a logistics bottleneck had become a live node in the US-China strategic competition, and the geopolitical pressure surrounding Haifa hadn't even peaked, because a crisis that nobody fully anticipated was about to validate Israel's Mediterranean gamble and complicate it at the same time. In late 2023, Houthi militants operating out of Yemen began attacking commercial shipping in the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Straits, one of the most critical maritime choke points on Earth. The impact was immediate and severe. Major shipping lines rerouted vessels away from the Red Sea entirely. Transit through the Suez Canal, the backbone of Asia to Europe trade, dropped dramatically. Insurance premiums for Red Sea passage skyrocketed. Some carriers simply refused the route altogether. For Eilat, the consequences were devastating. The port that was already constrained by depth and isolation saw its traffic collapse. Cargo volumes cratered. The Red Sea, the geographic advantage that had always been Eilat's reason for existing, had become a liability overnight. For Haifa, the initial read seemed like vindication. Under Israel's decades-long bet on shifting its trade gateway to the Mediterranean appeared prophetic. Mediterranean access completely bypasses the Red Sea choke point. Ships heading to Haifa from Asia via the Suez Canal only needed to cross the eastern Mediterranean. And if the Suez itself was too risky, alternative Atlantic routing could still reach Mediterranean ports. But a second-order problem emerged that complicated the narrative. Many global carriers, avoiding the Red Sea, didn't simply reroute through the Mediterranean. They rerouted around the entire African continent via the Cape of Good Hope. This added weeks to transit times and thousands of miles to each voyage, but it avoided both the Red Sea and the Suez Canal entirely. That rerouting didn't benefit Haifa. It didn't benefit any eastern Mediterranean port. It benefited Atlantic-facing ports in Western Europe and North Africa. The uncomfortable truth was that Haifa's strategic position had always rested on an assumption that the Red Sea and Suez Canal would remain functional and that Asia to Mediterranean trade would flow through established routes. When that assumption cracked, the advantage partially cracked with it. Haifa still gained some diverted traffic. Some carriers maintained Mediterranean routing and used Israeli ports as alternatives to congested Egyptian facilities. But the windfall was smaller than optimists predicted, and the underlying vulnerability was now exposed. Haifa's value as a transit hub depends not just on its own infrastructure, but on the stability of maritime corridors it doesn't control. If you're finding this fascinating, subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden forces behind the world's biggest projects, because the final piece of this puzzle might be the most consequential of all. In September 2023, almost simultaneously with the Red Sea crisis brewing, a dramatic announcement was made at the G20 summit in New Delhi. Leaders from the United States, India, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, the European Union, and several other nations unveiled the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor, known as IMEC. The proposed route is staggering in ambition. Cargo originating in India would cross the Arabian Sea to the UAE. From there, rail and road connections would carry it northward through Saudi Arabia, into Jordan, and across the border into Israel. At Haifa, goods would transfer to container ships bound for ports across southern Europe, Greece, Italy, to France, and beyond. Alongside physical cargo, the corridor would carry fiber optic cables, energy pipelines, and data infrastructure, a full-spectrum economic highway connecting the Indian subcontinent to Europe, bypassing both the Suez Canal and Chinese-dominated maritime routes. If IMEC materializes, Haifa transforms from a national port into something entirely different, a transcontinental transfer point, the hinge where overland Asian freight meets Mediterranean shipping, a direct Western-backed competitor to China's Belt and Road, running through American allies and economic partners. The strategic logic is powerful. IMEC would reduce transit times between India and Europe by up to 40% compared to traditional Suez routing. 1. It would create redundancy in global supply chains, reducing dependence on a single canal controlled by a single country, and it would pull economic gravity toward nations aligned with Washington rather than Beijing. For Israel specifically, IMEC would represent the ultimate vindication of the Haifa investment. Every dollar spent on dredging, every ton of concrete poured into breakwaters, every hectare of artificial land would suddenly serve not just Israeli trade, but a corridor spanning 3 continents. But IMEC has a fatal vulnerability. It requires everything to go right simultaneously across some of the most volatile geography on the planet. The corridor demands sustained diplomatic cooperation between India, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Israel. And it depends on the Abraham Accords holding firm and potentially expanding to include Saudi normalization with Israel, a process that has stalled under enormous political pressure. It requires Jordan's willing participation despite domestic opposition to deeper Israeli economic integration. It assumes no major military conflict disrupts overland routes through the Arabian Peninsula. And then came the Gaza conflict. Beginning in late 2023, the escalation threw regional diplomacy into turmoil. Saudi normalization efforts froze. International attention shifted from economic corridors to humanitarian crises. Some analysts now describe IMEC as indefinitely stalled. Others use stronger language. They call it a casualty of timing, a grand vision that arrived at precisely the wrong geopolitical moment, yet there are voices on the other side. But some strategists argue that the economic logic behind IMEC is so compelling that it will eventually override political disruption, that the Red Sea crisis actually strengthened the case for an alternative corridor, that once the acute phase of regional conflict subsides, the same pressures that motivated IMEC in the first place, supply chain resilience, competition with China, energy transition infrastructure, will push it back onto the table. Nobody knows which side is right, and that uncertainty is the point. Step back and look at what Israel actually accomplished. Nearly 18 million cubic meters of earth extracted from the Mediterranean seabed, over 100 hectares of artificial coastline that didn't exist a generation ago. On kilometers of breakwaters built from tens of thousands of concrete armor units and millions of tons of stone, automated terminals capable of processing the largest container vessels sailing the planet, an entire geography manufactured. The engineering is extraordinary. There's no other word for it. A country smaller than some American counties looked at its coastline, decided it wasn't sufficient, and built more of it, from the ocean floor up. But Haifa was never just about engineering. It never could be. Today, this port sits at the intersection of forces far larger than itself. Chinese strategic expansion through a 25-year operating concession. American security imperatives centered on a naval base less than 2 kilometers away. A Red Sea crisis that validated the Mediterranean pivot and simultaneously exposed its limits. And the most ambitious transcontinental trade corridor proposed this century, IMEC, which could make Haifa the most important port between Mumbai and Milan, or which could remain a line on a summit communique that never becomes reality. The concrete is poured, the cranes are operational, the breakwaters hold against the Mediterranean swells. That part is finished. What isn't finished, what can't be engineered, is the world around it, the diplomacy, the rivalries, the alliances that hold or fracture, the shipping lanes that stay open or collapse under pressure from forces no port authority controls. The next decade will answer the only question that truly matters. Can a country the size of New Jersey actually anchor a trade corridor spanning 3 continents? Or is that a bet that no amount of dredging, no volume of concrete, no feat of engineering can guarantee? Haifa is built. The answer isn't. If you want more stories about the technologies, mega projects, and hidden forces shaping our world, subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and tell us in the comments. Do you think IMEC will actually happen, or is Haifa's biggest chapter still unwritten? We'll see you in the next one.